Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through time, a journey to the origins of a civilization whose name still evokes awe and fascination today, Rome. How could a small city, state on the Tiber, grow into a world empire that dominated the Mediterranean and large parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia for centuries? How did that power form from humble beginnings, whose laws, architecture, language, and military strategies lastingly shaped the Western world? Join us on this odyssey through myths, wars, political intrigues, and social upheavals as we trace the fascinating emergence of the Roman Empire, from the legendary founders to the rise of the first emperor. Sit back and listen to the story of how Rome became what it was. Every great story needs a beginning, and the history of Rome begins in the midst of myths. The Romans themselves loved to trace their origins back to divine and heroic ancestors. One of the most famous legends is that of Romulus and Remus. It begins not in Italy, but in the burning city of Troy. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and son of the goddess Venus, escaped the destruction of his homeland by the Greeks. After a long odyssey guided by the gods and sometimes hindered, he finally landed on the coast of Latium in the heart of today's Italy. Here he married Lavinia, the daughter of the local king Latinus, and founded the city of Lavinium. His son Ascanius later founded Alba Longa, a city in the Alban Hills, which became the center of the Latins for generations. Many centuries passed. In Alba, King Numitor, a descendant of Aeneas, ruled, but his younger brother Amulius pushed him from the throne and killed his sons. To ensure that no further pretenders to the throne would be born, Amulius forced Numitor's daughter Rhea Silvia to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess obligated to chastity. Yet the war god Mars himself, so the legend goes, fell in love with Rhea Silvia and fathered twins with her, Romulus and Remus. When Amulius learned of the birth, enraged, he ordered the infants to be drowned in the Tiber. However, the servant who was supposed to carry out the order took pity. He set the twins in a basket on the bank of the swelling river. Fate, or perhaps divine providence, willed it that the basket stranded gently at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There, under a fig tree, a chic wolf found them, the famous Lupa Capitolina, who suckled them and kept them alive. Later, the shepherd Faustulus discovered the children and took them in with his wife Acca Laurentia. Romulus and Remus grew into strong young men, leaders among the shepherds. One day they got into a dispute with the shepherds of the deposed King Numitor. Remus was captured and brought before Numitor. When Faustulus learned of this, he revealed the truth about their royal origin to Romulus. Romulus then gathered a band of men, freed his brother, killed the usurper Amulius, and reinstated their grandfather Numitor on the throne of Alba Longa. But the twins wanted to found their own city at the place where they had once been abandoned and saved. A dispute burned over who should be the namesake and ruler of the new city, and on which of the 7 hills it should be founded. Romulus preferred the Palatine, Remus the Aventine. They decided to let the gods decide through bird watching and augury. Remus first saw 6 vultures, but shortly thereafter Romulus spotted 12. Both claimed victory for themselves, Remus due to speed, Romulus due to the greater number. The dispute escalated. While Romulus began to draw a symbolic wall around the Palatine, Remus mocked him and jumped over the still low rampart. In a fit of anger, or perhaps as a grim omen for the future inviolability of Roman walls, Romulus slew his own brother. "So may it fare with everyone who leaps over my walls," he is said to have shouted. Thus, Romulus became the sole founder and first king of the city he named after himself, Rome. The traditional founding date, later calculated by Roman scholars like Marcus Terentius Varro, is April 21, 753 BC. This foundation story, whether true or not, was of inestimable value to the Romans. It connected their city with the gods, lent a touch of destiny, and emphasized from the beginning themes such as fratricide, divine ancestry, conflict, and the sanctity of city boundaries, motifs that would recur again and again in Roman history. It gave the Romans an identity, a founding myth that nourished their pride and their belief in a special destiny. After the mythical founding by Romulus, Rome entered its first historical phase, the Roman kingdom. This period lasted from about 753 BC to 509 BC. Tradition speaks of a total of 7 kings, starting with Romulus himself. How much of this is exact history and how much is later embellishment remains a subject of scientific debate. Yet the traditional narrative shaped Rome's self-image. Romulus, the founder, faced the challenge of populating his young city. According to legend, he opened Rome as an asylum for refugees, exiles, and adventurers from the surrounding areas, but women were missing. To solve this problem, Romulus resorted to a ruse. He invited the neighboring Sabines to a great festival. In the middle of the festivities, the Romans gave a signal, threw themselves upon the Sabine women, and abducted them. The famous rape of the Sabine women. This inevitably led to war. When the Sabine men advanced under their king Titus Tatius to reclaim their women, the abducted women themselves are said to have thrown themselves between the fighting men. They had meanwhile built bonds with their Roman husbands, and wanted to see neither their fathers and brothers, nor their new spouses fall in battle. Their courageous intervention led to reconciliation. Romans and Sabines made peace, and Titus Tatius became king alongside Romulus for a time. Romulus is also credited with creating fundamental institutions, such as the division of citizens into 3 tribes and 30 curia, as well as the founding of the Senate, a council of elders to advise the kings. After Romulus's mysterious disappearance or his ascension to heaven, Numa Pompilius followed, a Sabine known for his piety and wisdom. Unlike the warlike Romulus, Numa dedicated himself to the organization of religious life. He is said to have reformed the Roman calendar, introduced numerous priestly offices such as that of the Pontifex Maximus, and ordered the construction of many temples, including the Temple of Janus. During his long and peaceful reign, the gates of the Temple of Janus, which were opened only in times of war, remained permanently closed. Numa thus laid the foundation for the Roman state religion, which was closely interwoven with political life. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, was the exact opposite of Numa, a warlike ruler. Under his leadership, Rome began to expand its military power. The most famous conflict of his time was the war against Alba Longa, the mother city of Rome. Instead of a great battle, the war was decided, according to legend, by a duel. 3 Roman brothers, the Horatii, fought against 3 Alban brothers, the Curiatii. After a dramatic course of events, the last surviving Horatius won. Alba Longa was destroyed and its population resettled to Rome, which further enlarged the city. Tullus Hostilius's constant wars and his alleged disregard for the gods, however, are said to have aroused Jupiter's anger, who finally struck him dead with a lightning bolt. Tullus Hostilius was followed by Ancus Marcius, the grandson of Numa. He tried to combine warfare and religious duties. He is credited with founding the port city of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, a decisive step for Rome's future trade and maritime importance. He further expanded Roman territory, especially at the expense of the Latins, and built the first bridge over the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius. The last 3 kings of Rome were of Etruscan origin, indicating the growing influence of the more advanced Etruscan civilization in the north. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was the first of these Etruscan kings. He was allegedly an immigrant from the Etruscan city of Tarquini, who rose in Rome through wealth and cleverness. He is credited with major construction projects, including the beginnings of the Circus Maximus, the great racing stadium, and the Cloaca Maxima, the huge sewer that drained the swampy valleys between the hills and enabled the development of the Roman Forum as a central square. He is also said to have introduced the insignia of power, such as the purple cloak and the curule chair. Tarquinius Priscus, however, was murdered by the sons of his predecessor Ancus Marcius. His successor was Servius Tullius, whose origin is mysterious. Some sources say he was the son of a slave woman. He is considered one of the most significant kings of Rome, especially because of his comprehensive reforms. The most important was the introduction of the centuriate constitution. This divided citizens into 5 classes according to their wealth, and each class had to provide a certain number of military units, the centuries. This division was not only militarily relevant, but also formed the basis for a new popular assembly, the comitia centuriata, in which voting was done by centuries. Since the wealthiest classes provided the most centuries, they had the greatest political weight despite their smaller number of citizens. Servius Tullius is also credited with the construction of the Servian Wall, a fortification that enclosed the 7 hills of Rome, although archaeologists today assume that the preserved remains of this wall only date from the 4th century BC. Servius Tullius ended tragically. He was overthrown and murdered by his own daughter Tullia and her husband Lucius Tarquinius, the son of Tarquinius Priscus. The 7th and last king of Rome was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the proud or arrogant. He seized power by force and ruled as a tyrant. He disregarded the Senate, abolished many of the reforms of Servius Tullius, and ruled through fear and oppression. Although he also achieved military successes and completed the construction of the great temple for Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitol, he made himself hated through his cruelty and arbitrariness. The spark that caused the barrel to overflow was a crime within the royal family. Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, raped Lucretia, the virtuous wife of the nobleman Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. Lucretia revealed the deed to her husband and her father and subsequently took her own life to preserve her honor. This incident triggered an uprising led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a nephew of the king, who had until then hidden his intelligence behind feigned stupidity. Brutus and Collatinus swore revenge and convinced the Roman people to abolish the monarchy. Tarquinius Superbus and his family were expelled from Rome. This happened in the year 509 BC. The Romans swore never to tolerate a king over them again. The kingdom was at an end. In its place stepped a new form of government that would determine the fate of Rome for the next 500 years, the Republic. The year 509 BC marks one of the deepest turning points in Roman history. With the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus, the rule of the kings ended. The Romans had shaken off tyranny and decided on a radically new form of government, the res publica, the public affair. This was the beginning of the Roman Republic, an era that would be characterized by unprecedented expansion, but also by deep internal conflicts. Supreme power no longer lay with a single ruler for life, but was divided between 2 annually elected magistrates, the consuls. The first consuls are said to have been Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the leaders of the uprising against the last king. The election of 2 consuls with equal powers and their limited term of office of only 1 year, annuity, were decisive principles to prevent a renewed concentration of power in the hands of a single individual. The consuls possessed the imperium, the highest military and civil command authority, but they could check each other through their right of veto. Only in extreme emergencies could a dictator be appointed for a maximum of 6 months, who possessed unlimited power to resolve the crisis. Alongside the consuls, the Senate remained a central institution. It originally consisted of about 300 members, mostly heads of the most influential families, the patricians. The Senate formally had only advisory functions, but through the prestige of its members, its continuity, senators were appointed for life, and its control over state finances, it exercised enormous influence on politics. The popular assemblies also remained. The most important increasingly became the comitia centuriata, already introduced under Servius Tullius, which was organized by wealth classes and military units. It elected high magistrates like the consuls, decided on war and peace, and voted on laws. However, the structure ensured that the votes of the rich upper class had significantly more weight than those of the poorer citizens. But the young republic was anything but a haven of equality and harmony. Society was deeply divided between the patricians, the old nobility by birth who claimed all political and religious offices for themselves, and the plebeians, the broad mass of citizens, farmers, craftsmen, traders, who had to perform military service but had hardly any political rights. This social and political inequality led to a centuries-long conflict known as the conflict of the orders. The plebeians often suffered under crushing debt, which could lead to debt bondage, and under the arbitrary justice of patrician magistrates. Their most important means of pressure was the cessatio plebis, The departure of the plebeians from the city. Since the plebeians provided the bulk of the army, Rome was defenseless without them. The first major secession took place in the year 494 BC. The plebeians withdrew to the Mons Sacer, the Sacred Mount, and threatened to found their own city. The patricians had to give in. The most important result of this first secessio was the establishment of the tribunate of the plebs. The plebeians were henceforth allowed to elect their own officials, the tribunes of the people, whose persons were considered sacred and inviolable. The tribunes of the people had the right of veto against all measures of patrician magistrates and against Senate decrees that were directed against the interests of the plebeians. They became the powerful voice of the common people in Roman politics. Another milestone in the fight for equality was the codification of the law. Until then, the law was unwritten and was interpreted by patrician priests and magistrates at their discretion. The plebeians demanded legal certainty. After years of urging, a commission was appointed around 450 BC to record the applicable law on 12 bronze tables and display them in the Roman Forum. This law of the 12 tables formed the basis of Roman law and guaranteed that laws were public and accessible to all citizens. It was a decisive step towards the creation of a constitutional state. The conflict of the orders dragged on for over 200 years with further secessions and gradual successes for the plebeians. In the year 367 BC, they achieved another breakthrough with the Licinian Sextian laws. One of the two consuls henceforth had to be a plebeian. Later, other high offices and priestly colleges were also open to plebeians. Debt bondage was abolished. Finally, in the year 287 BC, the Lex Hortensia established that resolutions of the plebeian assembly had the force of law for the entire Roman people, including the patricians. With this, the plebeians were legally largely equal to the patricians. Although the conflict of the orders was often accompanied by tensions and crises, it proceeded remarkably bloodlessly compared to similar conflicts in other ancient societies. It showed the ability of Roman society to resolve internal conflicts through compromises and institutional adjustments, and to further develop the political order. The integration of the plebeians into the state strengthened Rome's internal unity and laid the foundation for later expansion. Out of the old opposition between patricians and plebeians developed a new leadership class, the nobilitas, which was composed of rich and influential families of both estates and steered the fortunes of the Republic. The Republic had passed its first great test of endurance. While Rome struggled internally with the conflict of the orders, the young Republic also had to assert itself externally. The centuries after the expulsion of the kings were a time of almost uninterrupted wars against neighboring peoples on the Italian peninsula. From these struggles, Rome emerged not only as a victor, but also developed that military organization, discipline, and strategic foresight that enabled its later rise to a world power. Rome's immediate neighbors were other Latin cities, as well as the peoples of the Sabines, Aequi, and Volsci in the surrounding hills and plains. Relations with the Latins were complex. On the one hand, they shared language, culture, and religion. On the other hand, there were constant rivalries for supremacy. Shortly after the founding of the Republic, the Roman and Latin cities concluded an important treaty around 493 BC, the Foedus Cassianum, which provided for a mutual defense alliance and regulated relations for a long time. Together they repelled attacks from the mountain peoples. A traumatic event shook Rome around the year 387 BCA, the invasion of the Gauls. Celtic tribes from the north, called Galli by the Romans, had advanced into the Po Valley. A band under their leader Brennus moved further south, defeated the Roman army in the Battle of the Allia, and entered the city of Rome. A large part of Rome was looted and burned down. Only the capital, the fortified hill with the most important temples, could be held. According to legend, the cackling geese of Juno are said to have warned the defenders of a nocturnal surprise attack by the Gauls. Finally, the Gauls withdrew upon payment of a high ransom. Brennus is said to have thrown his sword into the scales while weighing the gold with the words, Vae victis, woe to the vanquished. The sacking of Rome was a deep humiliation that burned itself into the collective memory of the Romans and further fueled their desire for security and military strength. However, after the Gallic shock, Rome recovered remarkably quickly. The city was rebuilt, this time with stronger walls. Rome continued its expansion in central Italy. 3 long and bitter wars occurred against the Samnites, a warlike mountain people in the Apennines lasting from 343 to 290 BC. The Samnite Wars were a severe test for Rome. The Romans suffered heavy defeats, such as the humiliating capitulation at the Todine Forks in 321 BC, where the Roman army was disarmed and sent under a yoke. But Rome did not give up. The Romans learned from their defeats, adapted their tactics to the difficult mountain terrain, and developed the flexible Manipal legion. In the end, they prevailed and subjugated the Samnites. At the same time, Rome had to assert its supremacy against its old allies, the Latins. In the Latin War of 340 to 338 BC, Rome finally defeated the renegade Latin cities. The Latin League was dissolved. Rome pursued a clever policy of integration. Some cities were granted full Roman citizenship. Others received limited rights or became allies with different treaties. This tiered system bound the subjugated or allied peoples to Rome without making them completely equal, and created a huge reservoir of soldiers for the Roman army. Another key element of securing Roman rule was the construction of military roads. Beginning with the Via Appia, the construction of which began in 312 BC under the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, paved, straight roads soon crisscrossed all of Italy. They enabled rapid troop movements and promoted trade and communication. Along the roads, colonies were founded, fortified settlements of Roman citizens in strategically important areas that served as outposts and cemented the Roman presence. After the Samnite Wars, Rome was the undisputed supreme power in central Italy. The last challenge came from the south, from the Greek cities of Magna Graecia. Tarentum, the most powerful of these cities, called Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, for help. Pyrrhus was a brilliant general and a relative of Alexander the Great. He landed in Italy in 280 BC with a strong army and wore elephants. He defeated the Romans in 2 major battles at Heraclea and Asculum. But his victories were bought dearly, his losses so high that he is said to have said, "Another such victory and we are lost." Hence the term Pyrrhic victory. The Romans again showed their tenacity. They rejected Pyrrhus's peace offers and continued the fight. After Pyrrhus had unsuccessfully tried to gain a foothold in Sicily as well, he returned to Italy and was decisively defeated by the Romans in the Battle of Beneventum in 275 BC. He withdrew to Greece. A few years later, Tarentum fell and all of southern Italy came under Roman control. By around 270 BC, Rome dominated the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po Valley. It had risen from a small state to the dominant power of Italy in just 2.5 centuries. Its military strength, its political institutions, its ability to integrate defeated peoples, and its infrastructure formed the foundation for the next, even more enormous step expansion beyond Italy, and confrontation with the other great power of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. With dominion over Italy, Rome stepped onto the grand stage of the Mediterranean world. Inevitably, it came into conflict with the other dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. Carthage, a city founded by Phoenicians on the coast of present-day Tunisia, had developed into a huge trading empire controlling North Africa, southern Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. The Carthaginians, called Punians by the Romans, were masterful seafarers and traders. A clash between the rising land power Rome and the established sea power Carthage seemed only a matter of time. The conflict ignited in Sicily and led to 3 wars that entered history as the Punic Wars and lasted over a century, from 264 to 146 BC. The First Punic War began because of a local dispute in Messina on Sicily. The Mamertines, Campanian mercenaries, had occupied the city and came into conflict with Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city on Sicily. The Mamertines called on both Carthage and Rome for help. The Romans initially hesitated to intervene outside Italy, but the fear of Carthaginian control over the strategically important Strait of Messina tipped the scales. Rome sent troops to Sicily. The war quickly shifted from a land war to a naval war. Here, the Carthaginians were initially far superior to the Romans. Rome possessed practically no war fleet. But the Romans again showed their amazing ability for adaptation and improvisation. Using a stranded Carthaginian ship as a model, they built a huge fleet of over 100 ships in a very short time. To be able to use their strength in close combat at sea as well, they invented the corvus, a boarding bridge with an iron spike at the end, which was lowered onto enemy ships and allowed the Roman legionaries to storm them. With this tactic, the Romans achieved surprising naval victories, such as at Mylae in the year 260 BC. The war was protracted and costly for both sides. The Romans also suffered heavy setbacks, including the loss of an entire fleet in a storm and the catastrophic defeat of an invasion army in Africa under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus. But Rome did not give up. With a last exertion of strength and private donations, the Romans built a new fleet and achieved the decisive naval victory at the Aegates Islands off the west coast of Sicily in 241 BC. Carthage had to ask for peace. It had to cede Sicily to Rome, Rome's first province outside Italy, pay high reparations, and surrender its fleet. Shortly thereafter, Rome used a mercenary uprising in Carthage to annex Sardinia and Corsica as well. Carthage was humiliated but not destroyed. Hatred of Rome continued to smolder. Both powers used the time between the First and Second Punic Wars for consolidation. Rome subjugated the Gauls in the Po Valley and secured its northern border. Carthage, under the leadership of the Barca family, expanded its power base in Spain to compensate for losses in the Mediterranean. Here, Hamilcar's young son Hannibal swore eternal enmity towards Rome. The Second Punic War was the most dramatic and dangerous of the three wars for Rome. It was almost completely shaped by the personality of Hannibal, one of the most brilliant generals in history. In the year 219 BC, Hannibal attacked Saguntum, a city in Spain allied with Rome, triggering the war. Instead of attacking Rome by sea where it was now superior, Hannibal chose a bold and unexpected plan. He wanted to attack Rome in Italy itself. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal set out from Spain. With an army of about 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, he crossed the Pyrenees and southern France. Then he accomplished the seemingly impossible. He crossed the Alps in the middle of late autumn, under the most adverse conditions and constant attacks by hostile mountain tribes. He lost almost half his men and most of the elephants in the process. Yet he reached northern Italy and completely surprised the Romans. In the following years, Hannibal inflicted a series of crushing defeats on the Romans. He won at the river Ticinus and at the Trebia in 218 BC. In 217 BC, he lured the Roman army under consul Gaius Flaminius into an ambush at Lake Trasimene and almost completely destroyed it. Rome was in panic. Quintus Fabius Maximus was appointed dictator. He pursued a cautious strategy of delaying and avoiding open-pitched battle to slowly wear down Hannibal's army. But this tactic was unpopular with the Romans, who demanded a decisive battle. In the year 216 BC, the Romans under consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro fielded the largest army in their history up to that point, about 80,000 men, at Cannae in Apulia. Hannibal had only about 50,000 soldiers but was superior in cavalry. In the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal achieved his tactical masterpiece. He let his center fall back under the pressure of the Roman infantry, while his superior cavalry beat the Roman cavalry on the wings, and then fell upon the Roman infantry from the rear. The Roman army was encircled and almost completely wiped out. Estimates speak of 50,000 to 70,000 dead, including Consul Paulus and 80 senators. It was the heaviest defeat in Roman history. After Cannae, Rome seemed to stand at the abyss. Many of its allies in southern Italy, including Capua, defected from Rome and went over to Hannibal. But the core of Roman power, central Italy and the Latin allies, remained loyal. Hannibal, although militarily brilliant, lacked the means and siege engines to attack Rome itself. He hoped in vain for a dissolution of the Roman alliance system. In this darkest hour, the Romans showed their greatest strength, unshakable determination, and inexhaustible resources. They raised new armies again and again. They avoided further large battles in Italy and concentrated on winning back Hannibal's allies and cutting off his supply lines. At the same time, they opened new fronts. Under the leadership of the young Publius Cornelius Scipio, whose father and uncle had fallen in Spain, the Romans reconquered the Carthaginian possessions in Spain. In 204 BC, Scipio dared the decisive step. He crossed with an army to North Africa and threatened Carthage directly. Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend his home city. In 202 BC, the two great generals met at Zama. Scipio had studied Hannibal's tactics and was able to neutralize his cavalry. The Roman infantry prevailed. Hannibal suffered his first and only major defeat. Carthage had to make peace again on even harsher conditions. It lost all territories outside Africa. Its fleet was destroyed except for a few ships. It had to pay huge reparations and was not allowed to wage war without Roman permission. Rome was now the undisputed supreme power in the western Mediterranean. Scipio received the honorary title Africanus. The Third Punic War 149 to 146 BC was rather an aftermath. Although Carthage no longer posed a military danger, many Romans, led by the influential senator Marcus Porcius Cata the Elder, who is said to have ended every one of his speeches with the sentence, Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. Saw a potential threat in Carthage's economic recovery. When Carthage defended itself against an attack by the Numidian king Massinissa, and thus formally broke the peace treaty, Rome took this as a pretext for the final war. After a 3-year siege, Carthage was conquered in 146 BC by Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, and razed to the ground. The surviving population was sold into slavery, and the territory became the Roman province of Africa. With the destruction of Carthage, Rome had finally eliminated its greatest rival. It now dominated the entire western Mediterranean. The Punic Wars had brought Rome to the brink of destruction, but its victory demonstrated its military superiority, its political stability, and the unshakable loyalty of its citizens and many allies. The path to rule over the entire Mediterranean was now open. While Rome was still struggling with Carthage in the west, its gaze was already turning to the east, into the world of the Hellenistic kingdoms. These empires had emerged from Alexander the Great's huge empire after his death in 323 BC, ruled by his successors, the Diadochi. The most important were the Seleucid Empire in Asia, the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, and the Antigonid Empire in Macedonia, the homeland of Philip Sevi and Alexander. Greece itself consisted of a mosaic of city-states, often organized in leagues like the Aetolian and Achaean leagues, which constantly fought for influence and independence. Rome's first direct intervention in the east occurred during the Second Punic War. Philip V of Macedonia had concluded an alliance with Hannibal. To prevent him from supporting Hannibal in Italy, Rome waged the First Macedonian War, which, however, ended without a clear decision. After the victory over Carthage, Rome turned more resolutely to the east. Many Greek states, especially Pergamon and Rhodes, felt threatened by Philip V and the Seleucid king Antiochus III and called on Rome for help. In the Second Macedonian War, the Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus decisively defeated Philip V in the Battle of Cynocephalae. Flamininus solemnly proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games, an act that brought him immense popularity, but also underscored Rome's claim to a hegemonic role in the East. Rome initially withdrew its troops but expected good behavior from the Greeks. But the peace did not last long. The ruler of the vast Seleucid Empire used the power vacuum and advanced into Greece, encouraged by the Aetolian League. This led to the Roman-Syrian War, 192 to 188 BC. The Romans under Lucius Cornelius Scipio, the brother of Africanus, defeated Antiochus devastatingly in the Battle of Magnesia in Asia Minor in 190 BC. Antiochus had to evacuate Asia Minor up to the Taurus Mountains and pay high reparations. Rome distributed the gained territories to its allies, primarily Pergamon and Rhodes, and thus consolidated its indirect rule. Macedonia also did not rest. Philip's son Perseus tried to restore Macedonian power. This led to the Third Macedonian War. In the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, the Roman general Lucius Aemilius Paulus finally shattered the Macedonian phalanx. Perseus was captured. The Macedonian kingdom dissolved and divided into 4 dependent republics. The enormous treasure of the Macedonian kings was brought to Rome and made it possible to suspend direct taxation of Roman citizens for a long time. Roman rule in the East became increasingly direct and brutal. An uprising in Macedonia finally led to the establishment of the Roman province of Macedonia in 148 BC. In the same year, 146 BC, in which Carthage was destroyed, the Achaean League in Greece dared a final uprising against Rome. The Roman consul Lucius Mummius crushed the uprising, destroyed the rich trading city of Corinth as a deterrent, and made Greece factually a Roman protectorate subordinate to the province of Macedonia. Within just 70 years of the victory over Hannibal, Rome had also brought the eastern Mediterranean under its control. Egypt remained formally independent, but had long been a client state of Rome. The Seleucid Empire was severely weakened and slowly disintegrated. The conquest of the East brought not only immeasurable wealth and power to Rome, but also led to a profound cultural change. Rome came into intense contact with the highly developed Greek culture Hellenism. Greek art, literature, philosophy, and rhetoric streamed into Rome. Educated Greeks came to the city as teachers, doctors, artists, and often also as slaves. Roman nobles began to learn Greek and study Greek philosophers like the Stoics. Roman literature, which was just beginning to bloom with authors like Plautus and Terence, comedies and Ennius the epic, oriented itself strongly towards Greek models. Roman architecture adopted Greek-style elements like column orders and building forms like the theater, but this influence was not undisputed. Conservative Romans like Cato the Elder warned against softening through Greek customs and the loss of old Roman virtues, the mos maiorum. They saw a danger to the traditional order in Greek philosophy and rhetoric. Nevertheless, the Hellenization process prevailed unstoppably. Rome became the heir and mediator of Greek culture for Western Europe. A Greco-Roman hybrid culture emerged, which would form the basis of Western civilization. However, the conquest also changed Roman society and economy dramatically. The influx of wealth, land, and above all slaves led to massive social and economic upheavals that were to shake the Republic to its foundations. Rome's rise to a world power came at a high price. The ceaseless wars and the administration of a huge empire presented the institutions of the Republic, which had been created for a city-state, with enormous challenges. Society itself changed profoundly, and the resulting tensions led to a permanent crisis in the last century BC, which would finally lead to the downfall of the Republic. A main problem was the land question. The long wars had ruined many small farmers, the backbone of the Roman army and society. While they were in the field for years, their farms were neglected, or they fell into debt. At the same time, rich senators and knights profited from the conquests. They acquired huge estates in Italy and the provinces, often from the Ager Publicus, the state land that was actually intended for distribution to needy citizens. Hordes of slaves, whose numbers had increased dramatically through the wars, worked on these latifundia. They produced more cheaply than the free small farmers, who thereby came under further pressure. Many impoverished farmers streamed into the city of Rome, where they formed a propertyless proletariat, dependent on grain doles and the favors of rich patrons. This led to social unrest and weakened the recruitment basis of the army, since military service was originally tied to land ownership. At the same time, the gap between the ruling class, the nobilitas, and the rest of the population grew. Senatorial families increasingly viewed high offices and the administration of provinces as their personal property. Corruption and exploitation in the provinces were the order of the day. Governors often used their term of office to enrich themselves shamelessly. The equestrian order, a wealthy class of businessmen, bankers, and tax farmers, gained economic power but was largely excluded from the highest political offices, which led to tensions with the Senate. In this tense situation, two brothers from a respected plebeian noble family appeared on the scene who tried to solve the problems through reforms. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and Gaius Sempronius Gracchus. Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the people in 133 BC. His main concern was the restoration of the small peasantry. He introduced an agrarian law that redefined the upper limit for the possession of ager publicus and was supposed to distribute the excess land to propertyless citizens. This met with bitter resistance from the senatorial large landowners. Tiberius bypassed the Senate and pushed the law directly through the popular assembly, having a recalcitrant fellow tribune removed from office, a break with tradition. When he applied for a second term as tribune of the people contrary to custom, the situation escalated. His opponents in the Senate spread the rumor that he was striving for sole rule. At a tumultuous assembly on the Capitol, Tiberius Gracchus and 300 of his followers were slain by a group of senators and their clients. It was the first time since the beginning of the Republic that political disputes turned into open violence and murder. 10 years later, in 123 BC, his younger brother Gaius Gracchus took up the tribunate. He continued the agrarian reform and expanded the reform program considerably. He introduced a grain law that provided for the sale of grain at subsidized prices to the urban Roman population. He proposed the founding of new colonies also outside Italy, even on the territory of destroyed Carthage. To break the power of the Senate, he transferred the courts for extortion cases of senators to knights. His most far-reaching, but also most controversial proposal was the granting of Roman citizenship to the Latin and Italian allies, who bore a large part of the burdens of the wars, but were politically disadvantaged. However, this proposal met with rejection from both the Senate and the urban Roman plebs. When Gaius Gracchus applied for a third tribunate, his opponents used the opportunity. The Senate declared a state of emergency for the first time, empowering the consuls to do everything necessary to save the state. In the following unrest, Gaius Gracchus was killed or committed suicide, and thousands of his followers were executed. The failure of the Gracchi marked a turning point. Their reform attempts had exposed the deep divisions in Roman society and shown that traditional political mechanisms were no longer sufficient to resolve conflicts. Violence had become a means of political dispute. Roman politics increasingly split into two camps: the Optimates, who wanted to defend the supremacy of the Senate, and the Populares, who, like the Gracchi, relied on the popular assembly and the tribunate to enforce their goals. Often ambitious politicians who used the dissatisfaction of the masses for their own purposes. The crisis of the Republic was exacerbated by military challenges and changes in the military system. In the war against the Numidian king Jugurtha in North Africa, and especially in the defense against the Germanic tribes of the Cimbri and Teutones, who threatened Gaul and northern Italy from 113 to 101 BC, the weakness of the traditional militia army was revealed. In this situation, Gaius Marius stepped forward, a homo novus who proved himself a brilliant general. To recruit enough soldiers, Marius opened the army to propertyless citizens, whom he equipped at state expense. He thus created a professional army that was no longer primarily committed to the state but to its general, from whom it expected land and provision after discharge. This army reform was militarily successful. Marius defeated Jugurtha and destroyed the Cimbri and Teutones in the battles of Aquae Sextiae and Vercelli, but it had fatal political consequences. Armies became instruments of power for ambitious generals who could also use them for their political goals. The next escalation followed soon. The Italian allies, whose demand for citizenship had been rejected again and again, rose up against Rome in the so-called Social War 1089-188 BC. It was a bloody civil war that devastated Italy. Rome could only suppress the uprising by finally granting full Roman citizenship to the Italians. Italy was thus politically united, but the crisis of the Republic was far from overcome. Hardly was the social war ended when a new conflict broke out, this time between two rival generals, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla, a patrician optimate, had been successful as an officer under Marius, When the Senate transferred the supreme command in the important war against Mithridates VI of Pontus in the east to him, Marius and his popular supporters tried to withdraw Sulla's command with the help of the tribune of the people Sulpicius Rufus. Sulla's reaction was unprecedented. In the year 88 BC, he marched on Rome with his army. The first time a Roman general led his troops against his own capital, he drove out Marius and his followers and secured supreme command. While Sulla fought in the east against Mithridates, the Marians under Marius and Lucius Cornelius Cinna returned to Rome and established a reign of terror in which many of Sulla's supporters were killed. Marius died shortly thereafter, but Cinna ruled Rome for a few years. In 83 BC, Sulla returned victorious from the east, and a new, even more cruel civil war flared up. Sulla defeated the Marians in the Battle of the Colline Gate, before the gates of Rome in 82 BC. Subsequently, he had himself appointed dictator, but without the traditional time limit of 6 months. Sulla introduced proscriptions. Lists of political opponents were published who were declared outlaws and whose property was confiscated. Thousands fell victim to these purges. Sulla tried to restore the republic on a conservative basis. He strengthened the power of the Senate, curtailed the rights of the tribunes of the people, and restricted access to high offices. After pushing through his reforms, he surprisingly resigned the dictatorship in 79 BC and withdrew to private life. He died a year later. Sulla's attempt to save the republic, however, was doomed to failure. He had temporarily restored optimate rule, but he had also shown that power in Rome ultimately lay with the military. Violence and civil wars had left deep wounds. The republic continued to stagger towards the abyss, and new, even more ambitious men stood ready to seize power. Sulla's resignation and death left a power vacuum and a deeply divided republic. The order he created proved fragile. The next generation of politicians and generals had learned from events military power and personal loyalty of troops were the key to political supremacy. The last half-century of the Republic, from about 78 to 27 BC, was characterized by the rise of powerful individuals who fought for control of the state with their private armies. Two men who had made careers under Sulla soon came to the fore: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey had distinguished himself in the civil war against the Marians and subsequently successfully crushed uprisings in Sicily, Africa, and Spain. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, had bloodily suppressed the great slave revolt under Spartacus. Although both were originally Sullans, they allied in 70 BC and became consuls together. They reversed many of Sulla's conservative reforms. In particular, they restored the power of the tribunes of the people to secure the support of the populares. In the following years, Pompey received extraordinary military commands. In 67 BC, he cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in just 3 months. Subsequently, he received supreme command in the east to end the war against Mithridates of Pontus, which had broken out again, and against Tigranes of Armenia. Pompey was spectacularly successful. He defeated Mithridates, finally conquered Armenia, Syria, and Judea, and reorganized the east of the empire. He returned in 62 BC as a celebrated hero and the most powerful man in Rome. But the Senate, suspicious of his plenitude of power, refused to ratify his reorganization in the east and to provide his veterans with land. This drove Pompey into the arms of two other influential men: Crassus, who still thirsted for military glory, and an aspiring popular politician named Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar came from an old patrician family that, however, did not politically belong to the front rank. He was a nephew of Marius and had skillfully profiled himself as an advocate of the people. In 60 BC, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus concluded an informal alliance known as the First Triumvirate, a board of 3 men. It was not an official magistracy, but a private power cartel aimed at steering Rome's politics against the resistance of the Senate. With the support of Pompey and Crassus, Caesar became consul in 59 BC. He pushed through the wishes of his partners. Pompey's veterans received land, his reorganization in the east was confirmed, and Crassus's equestrian business partners profited from tax breaks. For himself, Caesar secured an extraordinary command as proconsul in Gaul for 5 years after his consulship. From 58 to 50 BC, Caesar waged a brutal but militarily brilliant war of conquest in Gaul. He subjugated numerous Celtic and Germanic tribes, penetrated as far as Britain and the Rhine, and expanded the Roman Empire to the Atlantic. He described his campaigns masterfully in his Commentary de Bello Gallico, which increased his fame in Rome. He amassed immeasurable riches and created a battle-hardened army loyal to him. While Caesar fought in Gaul, the triumvirate began to crumble. Crassus, in search of his own military glory, launched a campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east. However, he suffered a crushing defeat in the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC and was killed. His death removed the link between Caesar and Pompey. At the same time, Caesar's daughter Julia, who was married to Pompey and represented a personal connection between the two men, died. Pompey, who had remained in Rome, increasingly approached the Senate, which saw a growing threat in Caesar. The Optimates, under the leadership of Cato the Younger, demanded that Caesar must disband his army and lay down his command before his return to Rome, in order to run as a private citizen for a second consulship. They wanted to have him in Rome without the protection of his office and his legions to possibly indict him. Caesar was not willing to do this, as he feared a political attack by his enemies. He demanded that Pompey should also dismiss his troops. Negotiations failed. In January 49 BC, the Senate issued an ultimatum to Caesar. Thereupon Caesar made the momentous decision with the words, "Alii acta est." The die is cast. He crossed the Rubicon with 1 legion, the small river that separated his province of Gallia Cisalpina from Italy. This was an open act of rebellion, the beginning of a new civil war. Pompey and most senators were unprepared and fled from Italy to Greece to raise an army there. Caesar marched quickly through Italy, secured the support of many cities, and then defeated Pompey's troops in Spain. Subsequently, he crossed to Greece. In 48 BC, the armies of Caesar and Pompey met in the decisive Battle of Pharsalus in Thessaly. Although Pompey was numerically superior, Caesar achieved a complete victory thanks to his experienced veterans and his superior tactics. Pompey fled to Egypt, where, however, he was murdered on the orders of the advisors of the young king Ptolemy Sixiri, who hoped to secure Caesar's favor thereby. Caesar pursued Pompey to Egypt, was outraged by his murder, and intervened in the Egyptian throne dispute between Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra Vr. He placed Cleopatra on the throne, with whom he also began an affair. In the following years, Caesar defeated the remaining supporters of Pompey and the Senate party in Africa and Spain. He was now the undisputed sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Caesar returned to Rome and began a comprehensive reform program. He reorganized state finances, reformed the calendar Eller's introduction of the Julian calendar, settled veterans and proletarians in colonies, granted citizenship to many provincial inhabitants, and expanded the Senate to 900 members, also including many of his supporters from the provinces and the equestrian order. He had himself appointed dictator for life, a dictator perpetuus, and heaped numerous other offices and honors upon himself. He acted like a monarch, even if he officially rejected the title of king. His plenitude of power and his autocratic demeanor, however, provoked the resistance of a group of senators who wanted to defend the ideals of the Republic or feared for their own power. Led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, they conspired against Caesar. On the Ides of March 15 in the year 44 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar was murdered by the conspirators with 23 dagger stabs during a Senate meeting in the theater of Pompey. Caesar's murderers believed they had restored the Republic with his death, but they were mistaken. Caesar's death plunged Rome into new chaos and another, even more brutal civil war. The era of the warlords was not yet over, and the final end of the Republic was imminent.